The words of the gospel hung in the air of St. Catherine's Catholic Church as Father Miguel Rodriguez raised his hands toward the congregation of 200 faithful souls. Morning sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews where families sat in quiet reverence. The priest's voice carried clearly through the sanctuary as he spoke about the mystery of divine intervention, unaware that in moments his own life would be forever changed by the very miracle he was describing. And so, we must ask ourselves, Father Rodriguez continued, his dark eyes scanning the familiar faces before him, do we truly believe that God still moves in our world today? Do we have faith that the impossible can still happen among us? The congregation listened intently, some nodding in agreement, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. That was when the impossible happened. A thunderous crash shook the entire church as a massive statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe appeared from nowhere and struck the marble floor directly in front of the altar. The impact sent shockwaves through the building, rattling windows and causing several elderly parishioners to cry out in alarm. Father Rodriguez froze mid-sentence, his mouth falling open as he stared at the 3-foot-tall bronze statue that now lay before him. The statue had not fallen from anywhere visible. There were no shelves above, no alcoves, no possible source for its sudden appearance. Security cameras would later show absolutely nothing unusual in the moments before the crash. 1 second, the altar area was empty. The next second, a priceless religious artifact was lying on the floor as if it had materialized from thin air. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Father Miguel Rodriguez stood motionless at the pulpit, his prepared sermon forgotten as he stared at the bronze statue lying before the altar. His heart hammered against his ribs while his mind raced to find some logical explanation for what had just occurred. In 37 years of life and 12 years of priesthood, he had never witnessed anything remotely like this. The congregation remained equally stunned. Maria Santos, an elderly woman in the third pew who had attended St. Catherine's for over 50 years, clutched her rosary beads with trembling fingers. David Chun, a successful architect who rarely missed Sunday Mass despite his skeptical nature, found himself leaning forward in his seat, his analytical mind struggling to process the impossible. Patricia Williams, the church secretary, had dropped her hymnal entirely and was staring wide-eyed at the scene before them. Father Rodriguez had been wrestling with his own faith lately. The death of his beloved mentor, Father Antonio, 3 months earlier had shaken him more deeply than he cared to admit. Sleepless nights spent questioning his calling had become commonplace, and his prayers often felt like they were disappearing into an empty void. He had been going through the motions of ministry while secretly wondering if God was truly listening to any of them. Now this, a statue appearing from thin air during a sermon about divine intervention. The timing felt too deliberate, too perfectly orchestrated to be mere coincidence. If stories like this move you and you believe in moments where faith meets the unexplainable, make sure you subscribe because what happens next will leave you speechless. Father Rodriguez finally found his voice and dismissed the congregation early, asking everyone to remain calm while he examined what had occurred. As the parishioners slowly filed out, whispering among themselves, he approached the statue with careful steps. The bronze figure of Our Lady of Guadalupe lay on its side, completely undamaged despite the violent impact with a marble floor. David Chun lingered behind, his architectural training compelling him to search for rational explanations. He examined the cathedral ceiling, looking for loose fixtures or hidden mechanisms that could explain the statue's sudden appearance. He found nothing. The vaulted ceiling showed no signs of damage, no missing brackets, no evidence that anything had ever been mounted there. Patricia Williams retrieved the church's security system footage while Father Rodriguez and David continued their investigation. The timestamp showed the exact moment of the crash, but the video revealed nothing unusual in the seconds beforehand. One frame showed an empty altar area The next showed the statue already on the floor with debris scattered around it. "This is impossible," David muttered, running his hands through his graying hair. "Objects don't just materialize out of thin air. There has to be a logical explanation." Father Rodriguez knelt beside the statue, studying its intricate details. The bronze work was exquisite, clearly the product of master craftsmen. As he examined the base, his breath caught in his throat. Engraved in small letters were Spanish words he recognized. Iglesia San Miguel, Guadalajara, 1987. This statue had come from a church named after the Archangel Michael, his own patron saint. The coincidence sent chills down his spine. Of all the statues that could have appeared in his church, why this one? Why now, during his darkest period of doubt? By Monday morning, news of the mysterious statue had spread throughout the entire neighborhood. Maria Santos had called her sister, who told her daughter, who posted about it on social media. Within hours, St. Catherine's phone was ringing constantly with calls from curious believers, skeptical reporters, and people claiming they had experienced similar miracles. Father Rodriguez found himself overwhelmed by the attention. Local news stations wanted interviews, and a small crowd had gathered outside the church hoping to see the statue for themselves. He had moved it to a secure location in the rectory, unsure how to handle the growing spectacle. "Father, you have to understand what this means," Maria Santos insisted during her visit that afternoon. Her weathered face glowed with excitement as she spoke. "Our Lady chose to appear here, in our church, during your sermon. This is a blessing beyond measure." But David Chun saw things differently when he stopped by later that evening. "With all due respect, Father, we need to approach this scientifically. There could be perfectly rational explanations we haven't considered yet. Maybe someone played an elaborate prank, or there was some kind of optical illusion." Father Rodriguez listened to both perspectives while his own heart remained torn. Part of him wanted to embrace Maria's faith and see this as divine intervention, the answer to his struggling prayers. Yet another part of him, the educated part that had studied theology and philosophy, demanded logical explanations for extraordinary claims. The inscription on the statue haunted him. Iglesia San Miguel en Guadalajara. He had never been to that particular church, but the name carried deep personal significance. His grandmother had often told him stories about praying to San Miguel during her difficult journey from Mexico to America decades ago. That evening, Father Rodriguez called his Aunt Rosa in Phoenix, the only remaining family member who had known his grandmother well. When he described the statue and mentioned the inscription from Iglesia San Miguel in Guadalajara, Rosa's sharp intake of breath was audible even over the phone connection. "Miguel, you don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Your grandmother Elena prayed at that exact church every day for 3 years before she came to America. She had a special devotion to a statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe there. She used to tell me it was the most beautiful statue she had ever seen, bronze with intricate details that seemed almost alive." Father Rodriguez felt the blood drain from his face as Rosa continued her story. When she finally saved enough money to leave Mexico, she went to pray one final time at that statue. She told Our Lady that she was leaving everything behind to give her future grandson a better life in America. She specifically prayed that you would become a priest, Miguel. The connection was too specific, too personal to dismiss as coincidence. His grandmother had died when he was only 12 years old, but her influence on his calling to the priesthood had been profound. She had filled his childhood with stories of faith, of miracles, of divine providence working in mysterious ways. "Rosa, are you telling me this statue could be the same one grandmother prayed before?" "I'm telling you that God works in ways we cannot understand. Mijo, your grandmother's prayers were powerful. Maybe they're still being answered." Father Rodriguez hung up the phone with shaking hands, staring at the statue that now seemed to pulse with impossible significance in the dim light of his office. The revelation about his grandmother's connection to the statue should have brought Father Rodriguez peace, but instead it plunged him deeper in his spiritual turmoil. He spent sleepless nights pacing his rectory, wrestling with questions that seemed to have no answers. If this truly was divine intervention, why now? Why when his faith was at its weakest point? His seminary training had taught him to approach miraculous claims with careful discernment. The church required thorough investigation, multiple witnesses, and documented evidence before declaring anything supernatural. Yet here he sat with a statue that had defied every law of physics, appearing from nowhere during the exact moment he had been speaking about divine intervention. The weight of expectation from his congregation became unbearable. Maria Santos and several other parishioners had begun referring to him as the miracle priest, convinced that God had chosen him for something special. Their faith in him felt like a crushing burden when his own faith hung by the thinnest of threads. During his morning prayers, the words felt hollow and mechanical. When he celebrated Mass, he went through the familiar motions while his heart remained disconnected from the sacred mysteries he was proclaiming. The statue sat in his office like an accusation, challenging everything he thought he understood about faith, doubt, and divine purpose. God, if this is really from you, he whispered alone in the darkness of his bedroom. Why does it feel like torture instead of blessing? Why am I more confused now than before? The silence that followed felt absolute, as if even heaven had abandoned him to figure out this impossible puzzle on his own. Father Rodriguez's uncertainty began to infect his entire congregation like a slow-spreading poison. His Sunday sermons, once confident and inspiring, now carried undertones of doubt that sharp-eared parishioners couldn't help but notice. When Maria Santos asked him directly about the statue's significance, he could only offer vague responses about the need for careful discernment and patience. The congregation split into opposing camps. Maria Santos led a group of believers who were convinced they had witnessed a genuine miracle and wanted the statue displayed publicly for veneration. They organized prayer vigils and spoke excitedly about the special blessing God had bestowed upon St. Catherine's Parish. David Chun formed the nucleus of a more skeptical faction, comprised mostly of younger, college-educated parishioners who demanded rational explanations before accepting supernatural claims. They pushed for scientific investigation, suggesting the statue's appearance could be explained by elaborate pranks, mass hallucination, or undiscovered mechanical devices. Patricia Williams found herself caught in the middle, trying to manage both groups while fielding constant phone calls from media outlets, curious visitors, and other churches wanting to know more details about the miraculous event. The church office became a battleground of conflicting opinions and rising tensions. "Father, you have to take a stand," Patricia urged during a particularly difficult week. "The parish is tearing itself apart. People are choosing sides based on whether they think you believe this was a real miracle or not." But Father Rodriguez felt paralyzed by his own doubts. How could he lead others toward faith when his own spiritual foundation felt like shifting sand beneath his feet? The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday evening 2 weeks after the statue's appearance. Father Rodriguez sat alone in his dimly lit office, staring at his letter of resignation to Bishop Martinez. The words on the page blurred as tears he had been holding back for months finally began to fall. He had failed his congregation. The parish that had once been united in faith was now fractured by his inability to provide clear spiritual guidance. Maria Santos had stopped speaking to David Chun entirely, and several families had begun attending other churches to escape the tension. The miracle that should have brought blessing had instead brought division and confusion. "I'm not worthy of this calling," he whispered to the empty room. Father Antonio would have known what to do. He would have had the faith to see God's hand in this, or the wisdom to guide people through their doubts. "I have neither." The statue of Our Lady sat silently on his bookshelf, seeming to watch him with bronze eyes that held secrets he couldn't understand. His grandmother's prayers for his priestly vocation felt like a cruel joke now. How could she have known he would be such a failure as a spiritual leader? The rain drummed steadily against his window as he reached for his phone to call Bishop Martinez. It was time to admit the truth that had been growing in his heart for weeks. He was planning to leave the priesthood, to find some other way to serve God that didn't require the kind of unshakable faith he clearly lacked. But as his finger hovered over the bishop's contact number, something stopped him. A sudden warmth seemed to fill the room, though he had not turned on the heater. The warmth that filled Father Rodriguez's office was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It seemed to emanate from the statue itself, wrapping around him like an invisible embrace that penetrated deeper than his skin, reaching into the wounded places of his soul. The resignation letter slipped from his trembling fingers as he stood transfixed. Then he heard it, a voice, soft and familiar, speaking Spanish in the gentle tones he remembered from his childhood. "Miguel, mi nieto querido," my beloved grandson. His grandmother's voice, as clear as if she were standing beside him in the room. "Abuela," he whispered, his heart pounding so hard he could barely breathe. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was impossible, that grief and stress had finally broken his grip on reality. But the voice continued, filled with the same love and tenderness he remembered from 30 years ago. "You think faith means never having doubts, Mijo? But faith is not the absence of questions. Faith is trusting God's love even when you cannot see the whole picture. I prayed for you at that statue in Guadalajara because I knew you would need strength for dark times like this one." The bronze statue seemed to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the lamp on his desk. Father Rodriguez fell to his knees, overwhelmed by a presence that felt more real than the physical world around him. His grandmother's love surrounded him like a protective shield against all his fears and uncertainties. The people need a shepherd who understands their struggles, Miguel. Your doubts have not disqualified you from serving God. They have prepared you to serve him with compassion. When the presence finally faded and the warmth gradually dissipated, Father Rodriguez remained on his knees for nearly an hour, processing what had just occurred. The statue had returned to ordinary bronze, but something fundamental had shifted within his heart. His doubts had not disappeared, but they no longer felt like enemies to his faith. Instead, they seemed like companions on a journey toward deeper understanding. He understood now that his grandmother's prayers had not been for a priest who would never struggle, but for one who would struggle authentically and still choose to serve. His crisis of faith was not a disqualification for ministry, but preparation for a more honest and compassionate form of leadership. The resignation letter lay crumpled on the floor, forgotten. Father Rodriguez picked it up and slowly tore it into small pieces, letting them fall into his wastebasket like confetti celebrating a new beginning. He would not abandon his calling, but he would approach it differently than before. For the first time in months, his evening prayers felt genuine. He spoke to God not as a distant theological concept, but as a loving presence who understood human weakness and worked through it rather than despite it. His words were simple and honest, admitting his fears while expressing gratitude for the mysterious ways divine love had reached him. The next morning, he woke with clarity about what needed to happen. The division in his parish had occurred because he had tried to hide his own struggles instead of sharing them honestly. True spiritual leadership required vulnerability, not the pretense of unshakable certainty. His congregation needed a shepherd who could walk with them through doubt toward hope. The following Sunday, Father Rodriguez stood before his congregation with a different kind of sermon prepared. Gone were the carefully crafted theological arguments and polished rhetoric. Instead, he spoke from his heart about the journey he had traveled since the statue's miraculous appearance. "My dear friends, I owe you an apology and an explanation," he began, his voice steady but vulnerable. "For weeks, I have failed to provide you with clear guidance about what happened in our church because I have been struggling with my own faith. I want to share that struggle with you today because I believe honesty is more valuable than the pretense of certainty." He told them about his months of doubt following Father Antonio's death, about his fears that his prayers were falling on deaf ears, about the night he had written his resignation letter. Maria Santos wiped tears from her eyes while David Chun leaned forward, listening intently to this unexpected transparency. The statue that appeared among us was not just a miracle for our parish, Father Rodriguez continued. It was God's answer to my grandmother's prayers decades ago, and to my own desperate need for hope. But the real miracle was not the statue's appearance. The real miracle was discovering that faith does not require the absence of doubt, but the courage to trust God's love even when we cannot understand His ways. The congregation sat in profound silence as their priest's words washed over them. His vulnerability gave them permission to acknowledge their own struggles, their own questions, their own need for a faith that could coexist with human uncertainty. In the weeks that followed Father Rodriguez's honest sermon, St. Catherine's parish experienced a profound transformation. The divisions between believers and skeptics dissolved as people realized they could hold different perspectives while still supporting one another in faith. Maria Santos and David Chin even began having coffee together, finding unexpected common ground in their shared desire to serve their community. The statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe was placed in a place of honor in the church sanctuary, not as an object of mandatory veneration, but as a symbol of hope and divine presence working through human uncertainty. Visitors from other parishes came to see it, drawn not just by the miraculous story, but by the authentic spiritual renewal they witnessed in the congregation. Father Rodriguez's ministry took on new depth and authenticity. His sermons became more personal, acknowledging the struggles everyone faced while pointing toward hope. Young adults who had drifted away from faith began returning, attracted by a spiritual leader who admitted his own questions while still maintaining trust in God's goodness. The priest kept a photo of his grandmother Elena on his desk next to the statue, a reminder that prayers spoken in one generation could be answered in mysterious ways decades later. He often thought about her faith journey from Mexico to America, how she had trusted God's plan even when the path seemed unclear. 6 months after the miraculous appearance, St. Catherine's had become known throughout the diocese as a place where doubt and faith coexisted peacefully, where questions were welcomed rather than feared. Have you ever witnessed something that science couldn't explain? Share your story in the comments below, and let us know if you've experienced moments where the impossible became possible.